Good morning and peace to you. It is good to come before you and celebrate the fact that this is a day that God has prepared for us to share. Therefore, let us always rejoice and be glad in it. It is my hope that you are doing well, that you are healthy, that you are continually doing the necessary things to promote your safety, like social distancing as appropriate, wear a mask, and of course, washing your hands. Even as we celebrate our coming together, even in a somewhat unconventional way, we also remember those who are hurting today, either through the virus and its effects, or even those who've been affected by the wildfires that have devastated parts of California, even up the West Coast. So, just a reminder, we'll be live streaming the conference worship service at 10:30 a.m. next week, which will include a ceremony of ordination and commissioning. I am just overjoyed to be part of that service that will be performed by the bishop, and I look forward to you being able to virtually participate. The link will be sent out next Sunday morning, along with a shorter devotional video that will accompany the streamed service. I will see you then. For today, we will continue to talk about Jesus and how his life and example is relevant for us today. But first, let us hear the song, Because He Lives. because he lives. Though I try not to use gendered representations of God because, of course, God is not gendered in any way that we humans understand it, the beauty of the song still remains. Because God lives, I can face tomorrow without fear, knowing that God holds the future. And this knowledge makes a life worth living. And the quality of that life, as we think about our theme for today, is predicated on how we situate ourselves within the Christian tradition and how we understand Jesus. Jesus has inspired millions over millennia. And the Christological question of who Jesus was and what was the nature of his work has been lulled over since the first century. And I was prepared to write this in-depth sermon that dug deep into those questions. But then I watched a movie. It was the movie about the life of Fred Rogers called A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood. It featured Tom Hanks. It was all about how this ordained Presbyterian minister, known as Mr. Rogers, innovated children's television to teach generations of kids and adults about inclusion, love, community, and simply how to be a good neighbor. You can hear his voice in your head whenever you hear the song, "Won't You Be My Neighbor?" So when thinking about the message of Jesus, it is hard to find anything more clear than loving God and loving and being a good neighbor. We will explore that today, but first, let us hear the story of the Good Samaritan.
This morning's reading comes from Luke chapter 10, verse 25 through 37. A legal expert stood up to test Jesus. "Teacher," he said, "what must I do to gain eternal life?" Jesus replied,
"What is written in the law? How do you interpret it?"
He responded, "You must love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your being, with all your strength, and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself." Jesus said to him,
"You have answered correctly. Do this, and you will live."
But the legal expert wanted to prove that he was right, so he said to Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?"
Jesus replied, "A man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho. He encountered thieves who stripped him naked, beat him up, and left him near death. Now it has just so happened that a priest was also going down the same road. When he saw the injured man, he crossed over to the other side of the road and went on his way. Likewise, a Levite came by that spot, saw the injured man, crossed over to the other side of the road, and went on his way. A Samaritan, who was on a journey, came to where the man was. But when he saw him, he moved with compassion. The Samaritan went to him and bandaged his wounds, tending them with oil and wine. He placed the wounded man on his own donkey, took him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day, he took full 2 days' worth of wages and gave them to the innkeeper. He said, "Take care of him, and when I return, I will pay you back for any additional costs." What do you think? Which one of these three was a neighbor to the man who encountered the thieves?
Then the legal expert said, "The one who demonstrated mercy toward him." And Jesus told him,
Go and do likewise.
May the Lord add his blessing to this reading.
As I think about the timeless story that we just heard and juxtapose it with everything that is going on today, would you not agree that we need just a little bit more neighborliness in the world today? When we turn on the TV, it seems like crisis is on autopilot. Crisis in our nation and all throughout the world. At a time when everything feels just unsettled and shaky, I believe that is a good time to return to first principles as followers of the life of Jesus. And I believe that you cannot get any more fundamental than the principle of love. So the question for today's disciples is in a time of crisis and uncertainty, how does the unchanging principle of love inform us in the role of the present-day church? Howard Thurman speaks of this somewhat in the opening lines of his seminal book, Jesus and the Disinherited. He discusses how religious communities must be judged by what they have to offer to, quote, those whose back are up against the wall. And indeed, there are many in our communities whose backs are up against the wall, especially during this time of the pandemic and record unemployment. There's so much that needs to be done during this time that is characterized by racial conflict and toxic politics and gun violence and homelessness and hopelessness. Further, these efforts are even more complex by this socio-political environment beset with so much division and distrust, separation and fear, anxiety and hate. And it's as if there's this flow of information offering buckets full of bad news. But as I often said before, please remember that behind the mounting statistics, there are souls. And behind the numbers and the news reports, there are names. And as people of faith, as followers of Jesus, those captured by the dictates of love, it is a spiritual imperative to ensure that all people have access to live out their God-given lives with dignity and respect. So, in these perilous times, when we are too often defined by our labels or our skin color or our affiliations, be they red or blue, or our affiliations, be they I'm part of this religion or this denomination or the other, not losing sight of each other's humanity and responding sincerely through the lens of love and neighborliness is more than a good gesture or more than just some hokey thing to do. It becomes a revolutionary act. In his book, Luminous Darkness, Howard Thurman writes about the capacity to, quote, identify with and ascribe to the others the same sense of infinite worth that one holds for oneself. The ability to identify with one another on this level of connection made me not only think of Mr. Rogers, who seemed to have this uncanny way of connecting to children and adults alike, but it reminded me of the story that we just read, the one that is found in the Gospel of Luke. I'll recount it very briefly. So after an exchange with the experts of the law, Jesus affirmed the preeminence of the commandment to love God with all your heart and all your soul and all your strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. And then Jesus responds to the lawyer's follow-up question of who is my neighbor by telling a story. He talks about how there's a certain man on the way from Jerusalem to Jericho who was attacked and stripped and robbed and left to die. And a temple helper or Levite came, saw the man, then passed him by on the other side. And a priest then came, saw the man, and then passed him by on the other side. And then finally, a Samaritan came along. And he saw the man, truly saw the man, and was moved by compassion. And he went to him, and he dressed his wounds. He cared for him, brought him to the nearest inn, and did the equivalent of leaving his credit card with the innkeeper in order to take care of any unforeseen expenses that will aid in his recovery. Jesus then asked the lawyer a question. Who was the neighbor to the man who was in need? You see, this is where Jesus' spiritual and rhetorical genius was at work. The lawyer first asked him, "Who is my neighbor?" And implicit within that question of who is my neighbor is figuring out who is worthy to be the object of my love. But Jesus flips it to the subjective and basically proposes that it matters not in figuring who your neighbor is, but whether or not you are being a neighbor to all those in need at all times. In like manner, Mr. Rogers' spiritual genius for a generation was not in the posing of the question, "Won't you be my neighbor?" but in the fact that he embodied neighborliness. And he created an environment that demonstrated how to be a neighbor to all people, regardless of who they were or where they came from, and inspired generations of people because of his faithful witness. In fact, Craig Tuchek, a staff engineer for the city of Pittsburgh, where the Mr. Rogers show was based, started a campaign for this nostalgic tune of "Won't You Be My Neighbor" to become the official song of the city. Here you see a picture of the first poster that he hung, which includes Fred Rogers aboard a Pittsburgh streetcar and the full lyrics of the song. Tuchek later started hanging another poster that promoted the story of Francois Clemens, the actor who played the friendly officer Clemens on Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. It features a black and white image of Clemens dipping his feet in a baby pool with Fred Rogers, and with big black letters it reads, "Be the neighbor Mr. Rogers would want you to be." In a news clip, Tuchek was quoted as saying, quote, "I started putting the Clemens poster up after a lot of racial tensions was occurring around the country last year." And he goes on and remembers that the picture of Officer Clemens, who in real life was a black gay man, in a kiddie pool with Mr. Rogers really struck me because historically, pools were highly segregated, end quote. Now, I don't know what happened with that campaign that happened a few years ago, but Mr. Tuchek was a man who was moved into action by the life and witness of Fred Rogers, who was in turn inspired and moved by the life and witness of Jesus. But the question for us today is, won't we be a neighbor? Now, the qualitative element that defines the neighborliness that Mr. Rogers displayed and that the Samaritan embodied in his actions in ancient times was love. That is why Jesus tells the lawyer at the end to go and do likewise. Now, love can be this vast word, as expansive as the cosmos. One can even conjure the mysterious nature that caused the epistle writer of John to say that God is love itself. And we also know about the multiple layers of meaning evoked within the Greek, including the word agape. Fred Rogers describes it as this. He says, "Love is like infinity. You can't have more or less infinity, and you can't compare two things to see if they're equally infinite. Infinity just is." And that's the way I think love is too. For the purposes of today, when I speak of love, I am talking about what that Samaritan possessed. The capacity to truly see and identify ourselves in each other and know that somehow, some way, we are inextricably connected. I also take my cue from Dr. King, who said in his famous letter from the Birmingham jail, "We are all caught up in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny." Sounds like a neighborhood. You see, love is just not an act, but it's a lens through which we see the world, a principle for how we make meaning of the myriad of experiences we encounter in life. Love is our ability to see the fundamental unity of life in its innate connectivity. Love is embracing the essential oneness that undergirds all of our differences and particularities, while still knowing that no matter where you come from, we all share the same neighborhood. Through love's eyes, I believe that the Samaritan was able to see that stricken man's humanity, and then he moved into right action. Love engenders this undeniable ethical demand that compels you to act in ways that channel more compassion, more mercy, more justice, and more neighborliness. Martin Luther King Jr., again, in a sermon delivered the night before his assassination, noted that the first question that the priest and the Levite asked was, "If I stop to help this man, what will happen to me?" But then the Good Samaritan came by and reversed the question, saying, "If I do not stop to help this man, what will happen to him?" On that Jericho road, the Samaritan saw that he had a stake in that dying man's living and acted from a place of deepened empathy. In that moment, he cared not about figuring out who was his neighbor. He only cared about being a neighbor. So again, the question that we need to ask ourselves today is, won't we be a neighbor? Now, before I close, I will say this, that I would be performing ministerial malpractice if I did not say that being a neighbor in the manner of which I am speaking is an easy thing to do. You see, true love takes vulnerability. It exposes some things, including our places of privilege, our blind spots, our biases, our prejudices, our fears, and those secret places that we even keep hidden from ourselves. Love can sometimes be hard because it will take you there. It will make you see and taste and hear and smell and touch all those things left on the Jericho roadsides of today, from those struggling with addiction in our own community, to asylum seekers still stuck on our borders, to those suddenly homeless or displaced because of the fires, or those vulnerable communities that have been ravaged by the pandemic. The way of love is not easy, especially when dealing with those hard issues of the day. It can literally leave you broken-hearted. But we cannot afford to be afraid of our hearts breaking. My mentor once said that sometimes our hearts are broken so that they may be broken open. And the soil of a broken, open heart is made fertile by the willingness to stay engaged even when it is hard. And from within the rich soil of that broken, open heart space sprouts new shoots of possibilities for creative answers to the challenges of today. In short, it will make you act like that ancient Samaritan did so long ago, to be a true neighbor. And that is what I believe the church needs to be. People unafraid to truly be neighborly. People courageous enough to go wherever love may lead, regardless of the risks. And in a time of tumult, change, and transition in our world, in our nation, in our government, in our communities, even in our churches, in our very own lives, it is important to remember that you can never go wrong with love. And you can never go wrong with being a neighbor. As Christians, it should be our calling card. You know, Fred Rogers taught us that love is a sometimes difficult act of bringing people together. But that love also is not just a state of perfect caring, it is an active noun like struggle. And indeed, we have some struggling days ahead, and we have work to do. We have causes to advocate for in order to make real the promise of the beloved community, a place where no one gets left behind on the Jericho roads of life. But for all the things we have to do, let us never forget love. And let us then strap on the sandals of the Samaritans and put on our homely cardigan sweaters and face the world with confidence and the courage to truly see each other and help each other. Let us be faithful followers of Jesus, who said that if we get this discipleship thing right, then it will look like love, and love will be our calling card. And let us honor the legacy of those who lived lives of faith, like that slender Presbyterian minister from Pennsylvania who played with puppets named Mr. Rogers, who emanated the love of Jesus to the world and taught us all how to be good neighbors. So won't you please, won't you please won't you be a neighbor?
It's a beautiful day in the neighborhood, a beautiful day for a neighbor.
Would you be mine?
Would you be mine?
It's a neighborly day in a beauty wood, a neighborly day for a beauty. Would you be mine? Could you be mine?
I've always wanted to have a neighbor just like you. I've always wanted to live a neighborhood with you.
So let's make the most of this beautiful day. Since you're together, we might as well say, would you be mine? Could you be mine? Won't you be my neighbor?
Won't you please? Won't you please?
Please,
Won't you be my neighbor?
Let us pray. Dear God, we come before you today with humility. For as Fred Rogers said, little by little we human beings are confronted with situations that give us more and more clues that we are not perfect. But because of our shared imperfection, dear God, we come into this prayer moment with gratitude in our hearts. A gratitude that stems from knowing that you are a living God and that we are, despite of and because of all that makes us human, forever your children. And it is in you in whom we live and move and have our being. Knowing that you hear our prayers, we lift up the concerns of our hearts, those prayers spoken and those that remain hidden. We especially name those who are affected by the wildfires throughout this state, for the lives lost, and those whose lives are being turned upside down. And we continue to remember those affected by COVID-19, for those who have died, their loved ones, and those grappling with that disease. We also lift up those struggling with this overall season of disruption, a time in which the metaphoric fires of our political environment rages on. As we deal, as we reckon, and as we advocate and learn more about our country, our history, and ourselves, I pray that we may be held in the knowing that we still remain in you, our living God, embraced in this eternal love and grace that enables us to offer more hope and strengthened to be better neighbors in this neighborhood of the world that we all share. Pray this in your holy name. Amen. Now, may you go with God, and may you go in God's peace.